So this morning I talked about how it's far worse than I thought it would be. The U.S. cut off aid to, well, at least temporarily paused aid to Ukraine. Then they cut off intelligence from the U.S. And then they asked even Maxar to not provide intelligence by administrative request. So it's cutting off market forces that are going to allow that. And of course, the Russians are capitalizing on this. Now, I'm going to talk about why the reset button is broken. We keep trying to hit this reset. Every administration is trying to reset with Russia. We're not getting the message that Russia isn't going to reset. So, but there was this news today. Trump suddenly decided it's time to impose heavy banking sanctions and tariffs on Russia after their massive missile attack on Ukraine last night. Okay, so there was a massive missile attack, but what preceded that massive missile attack is cutting off the intelligence which allowed that massive missile attack to be more effective. Now, Russia and Ukraine negotiate now before it's too late, says the U.S. president. Again, Russia is the victimizer, Ukraine is the victim. And to say Russia and Ukraine negotiate because we got to stop the killing, you just don't, there's not the moral clarity that needs to be here. Okay, here's Trump's post based on the fact that Russia is absolutely pounding Ukraine on the battlefield right now. I am strongly considering large-scale banking sanctions and tariffs on Russia until a ceasefire and a final settlement agreement on peace is reached. Okay, so we're cutting off intelligence and aid to Ukraine on one side, and we're going to maybe impose some more sanctions on the other. It doesn't seem like it's fair to begin with, but part of this is because, and there was another comment from a commentator saying, so once we have decided that we're going to hit the reset with Russia, everything else is just theater. And I think that's kind of where we are. Now let's talk about this reset. All past presidents for the last, I don't know, 5-7 presidents have been trying, well, since George H.W. Bush. After that, Clinton forward, these past presidents are trying to hit the reset button. Okay, U.S. with Clinton, we have totally new approach to Russia. We're going to reset relations. And then what happens during the Clinton administration? Beyond the idea of Ukraine giving away its nukes under the Budapest Memorandum, which has assurances which aren't really guarantees, which look like it. On paper, they look pretty tough, but outside of paper, and Russia was the violator of that agreement. Okay, Russia invades Chechnya. Twice. Okay, but that's an internal thing. It's within their own, former country. We're going to look the other way. That's the way it was dealt with at the time. U.S. with Bush. We have a totally new approach to Russia. We're going to reset relations so that Putin can help fight global terrorism. And then Russia invades Georgia in 2004. I remember thinking at the time, yeah, this is bad. This shouldn't be. This is going to continue. That was 20 years ago, and sure has. Here's George Bush. He's at a press conference talking about how he looked into Putin's soul.
I wouldn't have invited him to my ranch if I didn't trust him.
Okay, that's the end of it.
Did President Putin use your concern at all about the spread of nuclear technologies by Russia, and is this a man that Americans can trust?
Yes. You want to go first?
Can we trust Russia? I'm not going to answer to that.
Well, that should have been a sign right there.
I could ask the very same question.
I'll answer the question. I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul. He's a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country. And I appreciated so very much the frank dialogue. There was no kind of diplomatic chit-chat trying to throw each other off balance. There was a straightforward dialogue, and that's the beginning of a very constructive relationship. I wouldn't have invited him to my ranch if I didn't trust him.
Okay, so that was Bush, and Bush should have known better. Okay, but so let's go back here. So we know what Clinton did, and Clinton was kind of, you could almost give Clinton a little bit of a pass because you didn't know better. Bush should have known better. And then we get on to Obama, or so Russia invades Georgia under the Bush administration. U.S. with Obama, we have a totally new approach to Russia. We're going to reset relations. Okay, remember that? This is Lavrov and Hillary Clinton, who is Obama's Secretary of State. We have a reset button. Ha 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 ha. Okay, and it didn't work out that well, did it? Because what happened? Russia annexes Crimea, intervenes in Syria. Okay, now we also had this. This was caught. This was Barack Obama talking to Medvedev, and like, do you remember this?
My last election, basically. Yeah, after my election, I have more flexibility. Yeah, I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir and understand.
Yeah, so Obama's not really doing that hot either with this. And it was during the Obama administration, again, annex of Crimea and the intervention of Syria. Then the U.S. with Trump. We have a totally new approach to Russia. I'm very strong. Putin loves me and respects me. So Russia makes more bases in Syria permanent. He expands operations in Africa, violates all ceasefires in Ukraine, and nothing happens. Then you have the U.S. with Biden, part one. We have a totally new approach to Russia. We're not going to permit it to attack Ukraine by doubling the number of blankets Obama sent. At least in this one, in the Trump administration, Trump actually sent javelins. Obama sent blankets, and the aid that Biden was going to send wasn't going to be much more useful than that. And then Russia invades Ukraine. Now, at this point, it's like Biden actually does something after, like, before the invasion, he sent mixed signals, right? Russia, you better not invade Ukraine. But if you do, like, it's not going to be very much of it. Okay. And then Russia invades Ukraine, and then he sends the famous message, do you need a lift out of there? And to which Zelensky says, I need ammunition, not a ride. And the Ukrainians actually fight. And then U.S. with Biden part two, we have a totally new approach to Russia. We're not going to allow Ukraine to win. Now, that's a cynical way of looking at this, but that's pretty much what happened. We're not going to allow Ukraine to win. We're going to give you aid for as long as it takes as we diminish Russia, but we're going to slow walk that aid because we really don't want Russia to collapse. That's where they were going. Okay, then you have Russia understands what's going on. And so then you have this. Russia is understanding the memo. U.S. with Trump. We have a totally new approach to Russia. We're going to try to help Ukraine win, or help it win in Ukraine. That seems like what it feels like. I'm not saying that that's what's going on. I am saying it sure feels like the deck is stacked against Ukraine. Okay, this is also insightful here as well. But okay, before I get to this, the idea that we're going to reset with Russia and everything will be hunky-dory after that is to totally misunderstand how the Russians think about the world and about us. Japan is no longer a hostile power. Germany is no longer a hostile power because they fought these wars of empire and they lost, and they had to reset in a meaningful way. A reset button without an actual reason for hitting it, for actually resetting the country, is not actually doing anything. It's like hitting the power button on a device when the power's already on. It's not turned off. It's not turning off. It's not resetting. It's just annoying. Okay. Here's Andrew Mitcha. Andrew Mitcha is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and with A.C. Socroft. And he says this, I've been following various analyses in the U.S. and European sources trying to gauge the goals of the new U.S. policy toward Russia. Since the word reset now dominates the conversation, I'll use it in this post, though I would argue it doesn't capture the state of affairs. The most obvious explanation is that the Kissinger in reverse, i.e., the Trump administration is trying to disaggregate the Sino, that's Chinese, Russian alliance, or at least put some daylight between Moscow and Beijing. Okay, so some of you have asked me periodically, like, what's Trump doing? Does he want Russia to win? Or, okay, putting the best face on it, Trump strategically may be trying to, and again, this is the best face, so, this may not be what it is. Trump sees China as the biggest threat. And so if you can peel Russia off of China, it isolates China a little bit more. Of course, peeling off Russia means you're kind of throwing Ukraine under the bus because you're making friends with Russia in the process. Okay. So to disaggregate the Chinese-Russian alliance, or at least put some daylight between Moscow and Beijing, if that's the case, it won't work. Different times, different circumstances. What's missing in this reset plan is a realistic assessment of the nature of the Russian state and Putin's objectives for the past 25 years. BLUF, that's a military acronym for a bottom line up front. Putin wants the U.S. out of Europe. It's been a key Russian goal since 1945 to fracture NATO and decouple Europe from the United States. And it looks like it's kind of working. Okay, it's frankly baffling to me that when it comes to our Russian policy, the administration seems to be operating without considering the basics of geopolitics in Europe and Eurasia. We seem to be mirror imaging instead of understanding the distinctly different nature of Russia. Yeah, until you understand that Russia's just different in the way that it operates, in the way that it thinks, you're not going to get it. I'm about to put up a video with Constantine. If I haven't already by the time I put this video up, watch that, because the Russians just think differently. He gave me a key insight about how Russia is actually understanding what just happened over this last week that I didn't see before, and what's going to happen on the backside of that, and critical dates to look for. So look for that. They just think differently. Okay, President Trump is right that an alliance can't function if our allies won't spend the money on defense. The largest allies. Now, let me stop there. That's important. Trump, to his credit, has been saying you need to step up and you need to pay your fair share in NATO. Stop free riding. Pay your NATO dues. NATO member nations, many of them have been going, you know what, we're enjoying it under the U.S. umbrella. We don't have to worry about anything. Everything's good. We're not going to spend on this. We're going to spend on whatever else we want to spend on. So Trump's kind of right about that point. Okay, he's right that the alliance can't function if our allies won't spend the money on defense. The largest allies, especially Germany, have been AWOL when it comes to meeting their obligations. They're now stepping up. They now understand. But NATO isn't only about the military forces you bring to the table. NATO is first and foremost about countering the Russian threat. Yeah, what's the whole purpose of NATO? It's a defensive alliance because the Soviets, now the Russians, they might do bad things. So you got to do something about that. And to do so, it needs a shared threat perception among allies about, like, who are the bad guys. And if they don't have that shared threat perception about who the bad guys are, well, it's not going to really work out very well. Since the end of the Cold War, that consensus on the threat Russia poses to Europe has not existed in NATO. We haven't all seen it the same way. And now it's the U.S. that's not seeing it the same way. How an ally sees the threat Russia poses to its survival has depended on where it sits on the map of Europe. The countries along the eastern frontier understand the existential nature of the Russian threat. You'll notice the most hawkish countries are Poland and the Baltics, and now Finland. Why? Because they're right there next door. They understand what their neighbors like. And the further you move west, the more that urgency dissipates. Without a shared threat perception, no amount of declaratory commitment to European defense will translate into real deterrence. And again, the key is deterrence. What we're doing right now is anti-deterrence. What we're doing right now is twisting Ukraine's arm to make them kind of knuckle under and come to the table, rather than provide them with everything that they need so that there's a real deterrent to Russia. We're just not doing it. The key reason it worked until now was because the U.S. provided the backstop and leadership in a crisis. Just recall the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. Or the key role that Biden administration played in rallying NATO to support Ukraine in 2022. Yeah, I got to give credit to the Brits first. The Brits were the first ones there, actually rallying the world to it, and then Biden finally stepped up and into it. So if the U.S. administration had concluded that Russia is no longer a threat, or even if it's only a threat to Europe, the process of NATO's decomposition will soon begin. And I'm afraid that might actually be the case. D.C. debates today favor the idea that we can disaggregate from the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, and that our insular hemispheric advantage will compensate for the disengagement from Europe. That we have oceans on either side where it's less of a threat. We can do this, and it won't cost us. I think it's going to cost us. This is a flawed assumption, for Russia and China have no intention to play along. depending on how Putin and Xi behave, we may see several other equally dramatic changes and realignments in the Trump administration's view of foreign and security policy. So I urge my friends in Europe to think calmly and to act proactively. You have a vital national security relationship with the United States, and we with you. Let's work on the problem. And I think this is a good way to think about what we need to be doing moving forward and what the problem actually is. The Russians, they just see the world differently. It's just different for them. And we need to understand that. So the reset button, it's not going to, we have to understand what we're actually dealing with. All right, my friends, tell me what you thought about that. Put that in the comments below. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes and the shares and the subscribes. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.